Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to achieve enlightenment or at least get a glimpse on your spiritual path, then do we have the Leap Show for you. Today I'll be talking with Steve Taylor, PhD, Senior Psychology Lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, the author of numerous books on spirituality and psychology. He's ranked one of the 100 most spiritually influential living people by Mind, Body, and Spirit magazine, and he's the author of a fantastic Please Read and Digest Slowly books, The Leap. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about the psychology of spiritual awakening and how we can all begin to access it. That plus we'll talk about the Ego Emperor, the Buddha and a raft, the wonder of Walt Whitman, bass guitar and a rock and roll lifestyle, the importance of Van Morrison, and what soccer, television, and Manchester United have to do with anything. Gotcha. So welcome to the show, Steve. Are you ready to shine?
Definitely. Hi, Michael.
Well, hi, Steve, and a mighty woohoo! So,
same to you.
Thank you. Before we dive right into things, I had a very strange childhood. I can remember at age 5 standing on my Fisher-Price toy car garage, staring out the window and closing my eyes and asking myself, if I close my eyes, does the world still exist or does it only exist because I'm looking at it? Then I slipped and knocked out my first tooth, and that's why I remember it. What was your childhood like?
I remember it as a very idyllic time. I just remember being, fascinated by the world around me. I remember staring at insects. I remember sort of staring for 15, 20 minutes at ants as they crawled around the sidewalk. And I remember endless afternoons and evenings on the park playing soccer with my friends. And I just remember everything seemed easy and everything seemed bright and everything seemed fantastic. So it was great.
Very cool. And what was the spirituality in your family growing up?
Only soccer, only football. There was no religion except for football. You know, you mentioned Manchester United. My dad was and is a massive Manchester United fan. So I had no religion, no spirituality, just lots of football and lots of television.
Cool, I guess. But it also sounds like a lot of nature time, or at least ant time.
Yeah, well, we lived we lived in a big city. We lived in Manchester, but fortunately we lived very close to a park. So I just remember spending all the time, certainly in the spring and the summer, just spending all the time wandering around the park and playing soccer with my friends on the park. So that was great. I remember staring at the sky and staring at the trees on the park. So yeah, in that sense, I guess my spirituality was nature.
I love it. And what started to happen with you around age 16?
Well, until the age of 16, I was a completely normal boy, completely obsessed with soccer, spent most of my free time playing sports. But around the age of 16, 17, I changed. I became a slightly different person, or a very different person. And I became quite solitary. I liked to spend time wandering around on my own. And I liked to wander around at night. I liked it when the streets were quiet. So I used to go back to the playing fields at my local school and wander around in the night, at nighttime, and look at the sky, look at the moon, look at the stars. And I just enjoyed the feeling of space and the nature around me. So I started to have these intense experiences of connection to the sky, to nature, intense experiences of well-being. And I had a feeling that I was connected to something larger than myself. I had the feeling that when I looked at the sky and the clouds or the trees, that there was something underlying them. They were expressions of something kind of transcendent, which underlay them. And that was basically what I guess I started to have spiritual experiences, or awakening experiences, you could say. But I didn't understand them at the time. It took me a few years before I understood what was happening.
And I imagine during that time there was really nobody that you could discuss these things with, and or would even understand what you were talking about.
Yeah, that was true. I mean, I didn't even try to explain it to my family because it was so different to anything that they could understand. And basically, I just thought there was something slightly wrong with me. You know, I enjoyed these feelings of transcendence, these feelings of intense well-being. And I loved, looking at the sky and the clouds. I loved nature. But I thought, I couldn't really I found it difficult to talk to people. My 16, 17-year-old friends, who were running around trying to chase girls, driving cars and drinking beer. I couldn't really function in that way anymore. So I thought there was something slightly strange about myself. I didn't really accept myself because I was so different to the way I was expected to be in terms of my family and my culture.
So how did you then get into college as you're experiencing these things? And then how did things start to change once you were in college?
It took a while. For a while, I became quite depressed because I did find it difficult to function in social relationships. I found it difficult to talk to people. I had no idea who I was or what I was meant to be. When I thought about in terms of a job or career, I had no idea what I might do. I felt a bit confused because I was so different to other people. But when I went to university, I was probably 19 or 20 years old. I saw an advert for a meditation class, and I had no idea what meditation was. I'd heard the term before, but I thought maybe it meant sort of deep contemplation, deep thinking. But I went along, and something attracted me to it. So I went along, and we meditated. I signed up for a course in transcendental meditation, a 5-day course. And I immediately felt this feels right. There's something about this which really attracts me. It felt like what I should be doing. But I didn't begin to meditate regularly. My mind was a bit too discordant, and there's quite a bit of turmoil inside me, so I found it difficult to sit down and meditate. But after that taste of meditation, I began to investigate Eastern religions, Eastern philosophies, and eventually I realized that what I was having were mystical experiences or spiritual experiences. So I began to understand myself. I thought, there's not something wrong with me. There's something right about me.
Woohoo!
Yeah. So it was a revelation. I read books about mystical experiences, and I recognized my own experiences. I read Eastern texts like the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita, and I thought, hey, yeah, that's the way I see the world. So immediately I had this new framework to make sense of my experiences. So after that, I was much more accepting of myself. I felt like I'd found the right path and I'd come home.
Awesome. So during this time, though, it wasn't all roses. In fact, you talk about what you call a period of purgation and renunciation.
That's right, yeah. Well, this was actually before I investigated spiritual traditions. When I was about 20 years old, I had no idea why I was doing it at the time, but I became very reclusive. I basically shut myself away. I stopped going to lectures at university. And God knows how I managed to get my degree in the end, but somehow I did. But I went to maybe 2 lectures in my last year at university, and I got rid of all my possessions, and I basically spent all of my time alone. I began to inflict pain on myself. I'd have cold baths in the morning. In the winter, I'd sleep with all the windows open. I'd sleep on a hard floor instead of a bed. So basically, in retrospect, what I was doing was following a path of purgation, which many Christian mystics do. So it was interesting that at the time I knew nothing about asceticism or Christian mysticism. But I think I was basically trying to, maybe it was 2 things. On the one hand, I was trying to rid myself of all the influences, all the environmental influences I'd had, and try to find my real essential self. But I think maybe I was trying to develop some self-discipline as well. So maybe that was it.
It sounds also like, if we take this on a global perspective, and if we look at life as not limited to this lifetime, you're also trying to remind yourself, hey, wake up. There's something more going on here, and to remind yourself of that.
I think so, yeah. I think something inside me was guiding me towards wakefulness, and maybe that part of me was trying to make me tune into my own inner wakefulness.
So what did Van Morrison and no guru, no method, no teacher have to do with anything?
Oh, wow. Van Morrison, he's my savior. Well, he was actually. One interesting story is that when I was about 21, 22, I'd already begun to investigate spirituality, but I was still I was just recovering from my depression, my early depression. I was just sort of coming out of it and finding myself, finding my path. But there's one night when I'd sort of had a girlfriend briefly, and she ended the relationship, and I was so desperately unhappy because I was so in love with this girl that I felt incredibly depressed. It felt like the end of, the end of my illusions. But one night, about midnight, when the same evening this relationship had ended, a friend of mine was walking by and he saw my light was on. He knocked at my door. He said, "Hey, I've just found this tape. I've recorded this tape for you. It's by this guy called Van Morrison." I said, "Okay, I'll listen to it." So my friend left and I played the tape. And immediately, straight away, it just grabbed me. I found such a powerful aura of serenity in this music. And I knew that this music of Van Morrison was depicting higher states of consciousness. And through listening to the music, I tuned into these higher states of consciousness. So it immediately touched something deep inside me. And it came at exactly the right moment when I was in this state of turmoil. So for the next few years, certainly next 2 or 3 years, Van Morrison was very important to me because I discovered this whole world of spirituality through his music. So this was probably in the early 90s, but I listened to a lot of the albums he made in the 80s, like as you mentioned, No Guru, No Method, No Teacher, Inarticulate Speech of the Heart. And, I realized that Van Morrison was obviously experiencing these higher states of consciousness himself, and he was writing music inspired by these states. So the music communicated these states to me. So it was very important to me in finding my new spiritual self.
It's interesting because you then ended up, music had you straddling, in a sense, both sides of the fence, because on the one hand, you're getting exposed to these, in a sense, higher states of consciousness. On the other side, you ended up, I believe it was playing bass guitar and then ending up getting pulled into a rock and roll lifestyle, so right down the other side of the fence.
That's true. Yeah, I think even though music can be very helpful in spiritual terms, Van Morrison and a lot of classical music is very imbued with spirituality. I learned that the musician's lifestyle itself is not particularly conducive to spirituality. The musician's lifestyle means lots of very late nights, lots of hanging around in bars and halls, and it totally disturbs any normal routine of existence. So it's very easy for musicians to fall into hedonistic lifestyles. And also, I was living in Germany at the time. It was in what had been East Germany. So there was very little outward signs of spirituality in old East Germany. It was a very scruffy, poor kind of place where people knew nothing about spirituality because after 50 years of communism. And there was a kind of bit of atmosphere of confusion in the air because, the people were just recovering after decades of dictatorship. So, yeah, living this musician's lifestyle wasn't conducive to my innate spirituality. So I started to drink too much and smoke a lot of cigarettes and too many late nights and so forth. So in the end, I felt that I was, again, losing touch with my spiritual core.
And it doesn't sound like it was, in my case, it was a couple spiritual 2x4s, actually almost physical 2x4s. What was it that got you to stop, to switch, to become a vegetarian, to completely change things in your life?
Well, there was one evening when I was in Eastern Germany, when I was still a musician, living this lifestyle. I was very happy because I knew that this lifestyle wasn't congruent with my essentials, authentic self. One night I went to bed. I'd been in a bar drinking till about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I fell asleep. And I woke up in darkness maybe 2 hours later. And immediately I knew that something was different. It's very difficult to describe, but I felt like I was out of my body, but still inside my body, that somehow my being had expanded beyond my body. And I felt somehow I was out there in the universe. I was part of the universe. I was like floating on this ocean of bliss. And I was filled with this tremendous sense of peace and radiance and harmony. And I just knew that the essential reality of the universe was bliss. Everything was just so incredibly blissful. And I felt so liberated. And it wasn't a dream. I felt more awake than I had been in any time previously in my life. So I was just filled with this sense of euphoria, this sense of connection. I felt like a wave on the ocean of the universe. So again, it was almost as if my spiritual self was calling me back. It was saying, hey, you've gone too far away. You've fallen into too much hedonism. come back. I'm waiting for you. So that was the beginning of a new phase in my life. So a short period after that, I moved back to the UK, to England, and I began to meditate regularly for the first time. I became a vegetarian. I began to practice yoga, and everything began to stabilize and fall into place. It was like I was really living in a lifestyle that was completely congruent with myself. So after that, things became a lot easier.
How did you go back to school, and then what was your master's degree dissertation?
Well, about 10 years ago, I was working as a college tutor, teaching people who were dyslexic. Only 2 or 3 days a week. I was always a writer. I was always writing in my spare time. So I always made sure that I had at least 2 days a week to write. And I made sure that I didn't need much money to live off, so I could have free time for writing.
More the poetic side of things, or?
No, mainly prose books. It was books on psychology and spirituality. Poetry came later. So, but in the year 2007, I discovered that there was a master's degree in transpersonal psychology in Liverpool, which is only about 30 miles away from Manchester here in England. So when I found out about transpersonal psychology, I realized that it was exactly the area I was interested in. Transpersonal psychology is really spiritual psychology. It's the examination of, the investigation of spiritual experiences, higher states of consciousness. It's investigating the psychology of Eastern religions. Mm-hmm. So this was exactly what I was interested in. It was what I was writing about in my own books. So I thought, I've got to do this master's degree. So I did it part-time over 2 years and really enjoyed it. And my dissertation was on people who had undergone spiritual awakening following intense turmoil and trauma in their lives. So I investigated cases of people who had been alcoholics, a woman who had been diagnosed with cancer, somebody who had been through intense stress and bereavement, and so forth. So in response to these experiences, the people had all undergone a shift into a new state of being. They'd all undergone spiritual awakening.
What did you learn? What is your biggest takeaway that you got after being exposed to so many people going through these experiences?
Well, one of the most significant things for me was that I realized that spiritual awakening is quite common. We have this kind of esoteric idea about spiritual awakening, that it happens to, I used to have this idea that it happens to gurus in India who live in ashrams. It happens to monks in Tibet who live in monasteries. It happens to Christians, mystics who spend decades meditating in monasteries and so forth. But in actuality, I found that spiritual awakening happens to ordinary people who know nothing about spiritual practices. It happens to ordinary people who live ordinary lives with ordinary jobs. And they just happen to go through intense psychological turmoil, which somehow dissolves away their normal identity. And when that happens, a new identity emerges inside them. It made me aware that spiritual awakening is latent in many people. There is a higher spiritual self waiting to be born in many people. And sometimes it takes a lot of psychological turmoil to dissolve away the normal self, which allows the new self to be born.
Would you say that if people, for instance, people who are listening to the show are interested in this topic, could that be a clue that there's something latent waiting inside of them?
I think so, yeah. I think in a lot of cases, when people have an impulse to follow spiritual practices or to take in spiritual teachings, maybe it shows that there is something inside them waiting to be born. It's a bit like, maybe I was a bit like that. I was instinctively drawn to meditation before I knew what meditation was. And it felt as though there was something inside me which was latent. It hadn't fully manifested itself, but it was guiding me in a certain direction so that it could manifest itself.
So what did you study for your PhD then?
For my PhD, I continued in the same vein as my dissertation, but I wanted to expand it further. So I looked at cases of spiritual awakening in general, not just spiritual awakening as it was related to turmoil. So I investigated 25 cases of people who believe they had become spiritually awakened.
And what did you find?
Well, again, I found that there was a really strong connection between spiritual awakening and psychological turmoil, particularly encounters with mortality. So I found that a lot of people, when they have a diagnosis of cancer or when they have a near-death experience, which I believe you had, or even just a serious accident, or it could be a serious disability. But that encounter with death can have a massive transformational effect. Many people who have near-death experiences, they wake up and they realize straight away that they are different people and the world is a different place to them. But even without a near-death experience, it can be a diagnosis of cancer. I've met people who have been diagnosed with cancer and they walk outside the consulting room after being diagnosed and they realize straight away, the world is a different place. Everything looks different. For example, there was a lady called Irene, whose case I investigated, and she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. And told that she would only live a year at the most. And she was diagnosed, and immediately she walked outside, and she said that it was the first time that death had ever been a reality to her. So she just felt this amazing gratitude to be alive at that moment in the world at that moment, even though she'd been told that she may only have a year left to live. And she said that she looked at trees and they seemed incredibly alive. The colours looked so rich. And she looked at the sky and she could see a kind of energy vibrating in the sky. And the sunlight looked so transparent and everything looked so perfectly illuminated by the sunshine. And she knew that something inside her had changed. And she said that that intense initial phase lasted for maybe 6 weeks. So it faded a little bit, but something about that remained. So she retained this amazing sense of gratitude and this sense of beauty. And she also had a new sense of mission. She felt that she had to do something useful or purposeful with the time that was left to her.
Thank you. That brings up, it's a perfect segue. And you hit a chord or 10 with me there. What is your life mission at this point?
My life mission is, well, I believe that the human race is facing a crisis point round about now. And I believe that there is a process of collective awakening underway. And I want to contribute to this process of collective awakening. So on a sort of a more practical level, I want to write books which provide people with orientation in spiritual states. I think the landscape of spiritual experience is quite unknown and quite undiscovered. It's quite uncharted. So I want to sort of chart the landscape and provide some orientation, lay down some paths and some landmarks so that people can negotiate that landscape more easily.
Let's do some of that today. Maybe let's take us back to the beginning, either the fall or this collective state of sleep, and then kind of sleepwalk us or awaken us on our path moving forward from there.
Okay. So when we talk about wakefulness, then we're assuming that there is a state of sleep as well. We're assuming that human beings' normal state is sleep. And I think that's true to a large extent. I think many people live their lives in a state of sleep. And that basically means that, on the one hand, it means a sense of separation. A lot of people have a sense of duality between themselves and the world. They are in here, in their mental space. The rest of the world is out there. And there's a basic sort of boundary between them and the world, which creates a sense of isolation. It creates a sense of incompleteness. It creates a basic level of psychological discord, that sense of separateness. It also makes it difficult for people to empathize and to feel compassion. It can make people a bit individualistic and maybe selfish. And also, sleep is associated with group identity as well. When people have a strong need to identify themselves as belonging to a certain nation or a certain religion, maybe a certain political group or an ethnic group, that need for identity stems from a sense of vulnerability, a sense of incompleteness. So that's associated with the sleep as well. And another thing is the desire to accumulate. So in our sleep state, because we feel incomplete, we feel a sense of vulnerability and maybe insignificance. We try to accumulate things to strengthen ourselves, to kind of bolster ourselves. So we try to accumulate possessions, wealth. We try to accumulate status, power, success. So these are all characteristics of the sleep state. They all fall away once we move towards wakefulness.
So I want to talk about how we start moving towards wakefulness. One of the things that struck me in your book, and I thought it was so beautiful that you shared it, and it's certainly a fascination with me who hugs trees on a daily basis, if at all possible, is you talk about some of the major characteristics of prehistoric and indigenous people's experience of the world, and believing that everything's alive and sentient and pervaded with a spiritual force.
Yeah, in my book, The Fall, I suggested that, and this is quite a common belief as well. It's not just me who's saying this. But the prehistoric peoples and also many of the world's indigenous peoples who retain this state for a lot longer, they didn't really have a sense of separation in the way that many modern people do. They had a sense of connection. So they were intuitively aware that they were connected to their land, to nature, and also to their communities as well. So contrary to what many people think, prehistoric peoples were very egalitarian. They lived in hunter-gatherer groups where food was shared, where resources were shared, where women had equal status. So they were very democratic and very egalitarian. And they were very respectful of nature. They didn't have gods in the sense that we later peoples had them. They didn't believe in gods. They believed in a spirit force which pervaded all things. Maybe they believed in spirits as kind of forces which could interact with them or with nature. But they had no concept of gods who overlooked the world. And they had an instinctive reverence for life, for other life forms. And many of the world's indigenous peoples retain that. Even now, some of the world's indigenous peoples retain this sense of connection to nature and this sense of the sacredness of nature, which many people, later peoples, unfortunately lost.
So how do we, thank you for sharing on that, how do we start down this path towards wakefulness?
Well, many people are naturally awake, so they don't need to follow any spiritual paths. They don't need to undergo a sudden transformation. Not many people, probably a very small proportion of people are naturally awake. Mm-hmm. And those people often become poets or painters, not so much spiritual teachers. But if you want to follow a path of gradual wakefulness, probably the most important element is some form of meditation. Probably the most important initial stage of awakening is to move beyond thought. It's the importance of realizing that you are not your thoughts, that thinking is just a kind of automatic process which takes place within your mind. Mm-hmm. And if you meditate, one of the things you learn is that you can stand back from your thoughts and observe them without being immersed in them. And you no longer allow thoughts to determine your mood or your state of mind. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily suppress thoughts, but you just watch them and realize that you are not your thoughts. So that immediately opens up a space within your being, the space between the witnessing of thoughts and thoughts themselves. So that space becomes very important. New energies and new potentials begin to flow into that space. And that's one reason why meditation is so important. It opens up this space inside our being. But I also think that service is very important too, serving other people. To an extent, that comes naturally once we wake up. But also, service can be a conscious spiritual practice.
It sounds like as we start to awaken, as we start to get more space, we come back, and we'll talk about this more. I want to spend a lot of time talking with you about kids, but our natural state of beingness, which has a lot more altruism or kindness or compassion, as we start to move past the protective egoic self, we start to feel more of a connection with everyone around us.
Definitely, yeah. We move from a mode of accumulating to contributing. We no longer want to take from the world; we want to give to the world, and that's an important shift. I found that a lot of people who undergo spiritual awakening suddenly in response to psychological turmoil, that's one of the major changes they go through in their lives. Is that maybe they had a professional, kind of high status professional job. Like Irene, for example, who I talked about earlier. She was a marketing executive for a medical company, but she felt that she couldn't continue in that role after her awakening. So she gave up that job and became a therapist working with other cancer patients. And that's quite common, because people, they feel such a strong desire to contribute to people or to contribute to the human race in general. And the desire to accumulate completely falls away.
Well, it's one of the challenges, if we can call it that, I guess so, of this path is, you hear about it when people have a spontaneous Kundalini awakening, for example, or people who suddenly come awake, is the integration is a real, it's a bitch.
It can be. Yeah, it can be a real challenge. Yeah. Kundalini awakening is a form of sudden and dramatic awakening. But Kundalini awakenings are very explosive, energetic awakenings. They're a bit like an earthquake, which kind of blows apart the normal psyche. And it can take a long, long time for the earthquake to settle down again. And basically, Kundalini awakening is so powerful that the normal psychological structures can be blown apart, so people can find it difficult to concentrate. They can find it difficult to remember things, difficult to function in everyday life, even difficult to hold conversations. So all of the normal psychological functions which our mind performs for us become very difficult. And the whole of physically, the organism is disrupted as well. So there can be lots of strange electric sensations within the body, unexplained pains, extreme hunger, thirst, and inability to sleep. So the whole metabolism is disrupted, and it takes a long time for it to settle down again.
I guess this is a good reason to do this. I call it the kind, gentle, easy, good manner of doing things. Take it nice and slow, let it come gradually.
Yeah, I think one of the problems which can occur is that when people have these strange physical symptoms and these psychological disturbances, usually they don't have a background in spirituality, so they don't really know what's happening. They think they've got a bit crazy, and they try to explain it to their family, to their friends, and their friends say, "Oh, you should go to see a doctor." So they go to a doctor. The doctor says, "It sounds like you're having a psychotic breakdown. So I'm going to take you to see a psychiatrist." The psychiatrist prescribes medication, or sometimes they may even be admitted to psychiatric hospitals. And that's quite tragic when that happens.
Isn't that ironic that as you are becoming more awake and more aware, that the mainstream establishment would say, well, that clearly means you're having a break from, quote, reality. We've got to do something with you.
That's true. Yeah, but I think sudden and dramatic energetic awakenings can cause, they have characteristics which may appear to be similar to psychosis. They're not really, but psychological disturbances can look similar to psychosis. So we need to have psychiatrists who are aware of spiritual awakening, so that they can distinguish between real psychosis and spiritual awakening.
Can you share with us briefly? I was fascinated by the story of Russell Williams.
Oh, yeah. Well, Russell, he's a friend of mine. He's 96 years old, and he's a spiritual teacher here in Manchester, England. And he is he's lived an incredibly fascinating life. He was born in 1921 in London. So he lived through the Second World War. He was at Dunkirk, which is very famous in England. That was when the British soldiers were evacuated from France because the Germans were catching up with them. So hundreds of thousands of soldiers were evacuated. It was a very tragic and important event in the Second World War. So Russell was there. He was also in London during the Blitz, when London was destroyed by German bombers. And also he was an orphan. At the age of 11, both his parents died. So from the age of 11, he was basically supporting himself. So after the difficulties of his early life and the trauma of the Second World War, he was completely broken down. He just felt that he'd been through so much suffering that he could no longer function. So he became a kind of tramp. He just wandered around for months, just trying to, not knowing who he was or what he was supposed to do. But after several months, he was wandering around, and he met somebody who gave him a job at a circus, looking after horses. So he took this job looking after horses, and he groomed horses for the circus. And for 3 years, he spent practically every moment of the day with these horses. He would sleep in the stable with them, groom them, feed them, and so forth. And he developed a very powerful rapport with the horses, to the extent that he could heal them, spiritually heal the horses. And he developed his own language to speak with the horses. And after 3 years, he woke up one morning, and he describes it as he woke up and saw the steam. It was a winter morning. He saw steam emerging from the horse's nose, as it does on a winter's morning. And he immediately realized that he was the horse. He was inside the horse. There was no difference between him and the horse. He looked at other horses, and he felt the same, that he was inside them. He was them. He looked at other animals. He went outside and looked at the trees, and he realized that he was everything. There was nothing outside, nothing inside. He was everything. So he had a spiritual awakening, and like a lot of people who have spiritual awakenings, he thought it would fade away, but it didn't. He retained this sense of connection, this sense of unity with the world around him. And he also stopped thinking. His mind became suddenly clear and suddenly empty. He thinked when he needed to, maybe when he had to make decisions or plans, but otherwise his mind was empty. So he'd had a spiritual awakening, but he didn't have the language to understand, or the knowledge to understand what had happened to him. So at the same time, after a while, he became a little confused. He tried to explain it to people, but people would say, "Oh, you sound like you've gone crazy." And he would speak to religious people, vicars or priests, and they would say, "Oh, you sound like you're being blasphemous. This isn't Christianity." So after a while, he thought he'd gone crazy because everyone else told him he was crazy. So this went on for maybe 2 or 3 years, this sense of confusion, maybe slightly longer. So one night he became very frustrated, and he said, "Somebody help me, I'm so confused. I don't know who I am. I feel that something important's happened to me, but nobody understands it. So I feel like I've gone mad." And he had a vision of a face, a kind of Asian face in his mind. He could see this face, and immediately this sense of peace began to fill him. This sense of freedom and peace just flowed through him. And he felt suddenly liberated again. His original awakening returned more powerfully at that point. And just a few days later, by chance, he met a Buddhist in London. This was 1959. And he started talking to this Buddhist, and this Buddhist said...
I love it, by chance. I'm going to put that in air quotes here.
Yeah, by chance, in inverted commas. He met a Buddhist, and the Buddhist said, everything you say sounds like a Buddhist teaching. Everything you say sounds like a Buddhist text. And the guy was amazed that Russell knew nothing about spiritual teachings. So he realized that Russell was a naturally awakened person. So this guy was a member of a Buddhist group, and they adopted Russell as their teacher. So he became a spiritual teacher. So ever since then, he's been for 60 years now, at least, he's been a spiritual teacher. And so remarkably, he published his first book 2 years ago at the age of 93, I think.
Wow. As we go down, what's the most profound teaching you've gotten from him?
The most profound teaching which Russell has given me is he has taught me the importance of treating inanimate objects with care and love. Russell says that even with door handles, when you open the door, just gently hold the door handle, touch it as you open the door, and, show it respect.
Yeah.
And when you do the dishes, when you wash the dishes, do it gently with respect, and gently caress the sponge and the plates. So that's something you can practice every moment of the day. When I lift up this cup, I can hold the cup, I can feel the cup, I can treat it with respect. And as soon as you do that, you realize that it is a meditative exercise. On the one hand, it makes you connected to everything around you. The whole of your surroundings becomes part of you. And in a sense, you feel that the respect that you give to objects comes back to you in some sense.
It sounds like, for lack of a proper term for it, a natural state changer, a reminder in each moment. I grab this, I show it respect. I'm coming from, it's something I've been writing about lately, about how everything is sacred. You experience the sacredness of it, and then you experience the sacredness or sanctity of everything in your life in that moment.
Yeah, that's true. And I also practice it when, in any moment of the day, you have a choice. You can either immerse your attention in thoughts.
Yeah.
You can either immerse your attention in an activity or a book, some kind of distraction or activity, or you can give your attention to your experience and your surroundings. So I find that at any moment I can give my full attention to my surroundings. So even if I'm in my living room, which I've seen for 13 years, every moment, every day for 13 years, it's so familiar to me. But if I really give my attention to it right now, I can see new things. Everything becomes new. Everything becomes real, fascinating, very vivid. And, there is a sense of harmony as well. There's a sense of harmony in being present.
I love that. I love it. I love it. And perfect segue from there, from this presence that you're talking about and from this vividness that you're seeing in the experience. Maybe you can tell us about when your mom reintroduced you to childhood building blocks you hadn't seen in over 30 years.
Wow, yeah. My mom, she brought down some toys from her attic. I had no idea she'd kept these toys. It's like a big box of building blocks and some magazines, some comics, and some cuddly toys. And immediately when I saw the magazines and the building blocks, they felt incredibly familiar, even though I hadn't seen them since the age of 10, probably. So that was 30 years ago at that time. And I just couldn't believe how incredibly beautiful and fascinating, particularly the building blocks. When I see my own kids playing with Lego building blocks now, I can imagine how they feel, because when these building blocks are so perfect, so it's difficult to describe how perfect and how wonderful and fascinating they were. And these little cars, these little gas stations I would build, and these trucks, these little houses, they were so incredibly vivid and so intensely real. So it gave me a little glimpse of, how the world appears to young children. So I think young children are naturally spiritually awakened to some degree, because they have this amazingly vivid and intense perception.
What do you think is going on with children? Well, first tell us about children and their connection to the world. Then I want to talk about what's going on with the world today.
Okay. Well, children, in many ways, as I say, they have characteristics of spiritual wakefulness. On the one hand, they have this vivid perception. Mm-hmm. They are also intensely present. Children don't care about the future. They don't care about the past. They give their whole attention to their present experience. And also, they don't really experience separation in the way which adults do. The adult ego develops maybe during adolescence, mm-hmm. maybe the age of 12, 13, 14, it begins. So before then, there's no real sense of separateness. Children
What do you mean by
participate.
separateness?
I mean, there's no real sense of being somebody who exists in mental space inside your head, who exists in duality to the world out there.
And so kids early on, they don't have the separation.
Yeah, that's right. They don't really have a sense of separation. They don't really have a sense of time either. You know, time and separateness are quite closely linked. So they live in a kind of timeless state as well, which is why, you know, children always say, "Are we nearly there yet?" in the car, you know, and their time is so expansive to children. But when we become adults, you know, time becomes linear, becomes more constricted as we develop a sense of separateness.
Would you say kids are hardwired for compassion or altruism?
To some degree, yeah. There was a psychologist called Piaget, who's quite a famous psychologist. He believed that children could not be empathic or compassionate because they couldn't take the perspective of other people. But later research shows that that's not really true, that even young babies of 1 year old or 18 months old, they can be altruistic. They can help, you know, they can show signs of compassion if someone around them is upset. So that's largely been disproved in psychology. Most developmental psychologists now believe that children are empathic and altruistic.
Would you say that kids are coming into, I want to kind of go into this evolutionary leap or collective awakening, and maybe you can give us some guideposts, some more guideposts on this journey. Would you say that kids are coming into this world more awake or aware or connected today?
It's difficult to say, really. I think that, you know, young children are naturally awakened, and when we become awakened as adults, it's like turning full circle. We regain many of the elements of early childhood. Not quite the same way. I mean, there are some ways in which childhood wakefulness is different to adult wakefulness, and children are obviously quite tempestuous as well. You know, sometimes I say that young children are a combination of enlightened beings and narcissistic monsters, because sometimes children can get upset when their desires are not satisfied, you know. And that's a big difference, because in adult wakefulness, there's a lot of stability. There's a lot of emotional stability, and those kind of discordant emotions tend to fade away. Mm-hmm. But I mean, my feeling is that children have always been naturally awakened, and, you know, they are still today.
Beautiful. You know, you were talking about at the very beginning, or kind of along your mission, and maybe you can share with us about that. And I know it's part of my mission to help people to understand that it's not all a bad thing.
Yeah. I mean, the world can seem pretty bleak at the moment. There seems to be a return of nationalism and protectionism. People seem to be clinging to national and ethnic identities more strongly, political identities more strongly. But I think in general, if you look back over the last 300 years or so, there's been a slow, gradual process of collective awakening, which has manifested in various ways. I mean, 300 years ago, in the latter part of the 18th century, there was a sudden upsurge in compassion, which manifested itself in the beginning of the animal rights movement, the beginning of the women's rights movement, anti-slavery movement, more humane treatment of criminals, and it led to the egalitarian ideals of the French Revolution and the American Constitution. So since then, there's been an increasing process of, it's basically a transcendence of ego separation. You know, when you transcend the ego, you develop compassion. You begin to identify with other people, with other living beings. And that has manifested itself in lots of cultural changes. It's manifested itself in an increasing sense of connection to nature, which leads to the environmental movement, ecological movement, vegetarianism, and so forth. And in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been this amazing upsurge in interest in spirituality and spiritual practices and Eastern spiritual philosophies. So that to me is another sign that there is a process of awakening underway. And also the fact that so many people now in my research are undergoing sudden and dramatic awakenings in response to turmoil. That seems to suggest to me that there is a latent wakefulness within the the collective psyche of the human race, which is becoming more powerful. It's building up more momentum, and it's manifesting itself in many different ways. But the negative side of that is that the values of the sleep state, the old values of materialism and nationalism, all of those kind of egoic values, they are feeling threatened by this growing wakefulness. So they are reasserting themselves more strongly. And I think that's what's happening at the moment, is that the old egoic values of materialism and, a lack of empathy, a lack of connection, they're becoming stronger, and they're manifesting themselves in nationalism and Brexit in the UK and so forth. But I think, in a way that's inevitable, because when any values are threatened, they try to become more rigid to maintain themselves. But in becoming more rigid, they hasten their own demise, because, as we know, rigidity is easily broken. Softness survives.
Kind, gentle, easy, good.
Yeah.
So what are a couple other key steps we can take on this journey? Meditation is a huge one. Service is another one. What else can we do to help us on the journey, whether or not a 2x4 may come our way?
I would say detachment. And by that I mean not depending on external things for your well-being. Mm-hmm. We can enjoy external things. We can enjoy chocolate. We can enjoy possessions. You can enjoy swimming in a swimming pool. But you don't have to be psychologically attached to them. So I think what happens when people undergo a shift into wakefulness following psychological turmoil is that they let go of their psychological attachments. Mm-hmm. So if somebody is diagnosed with cancer, like Irene, who I mentioned earlier, they have to let go of their attachment to the future, because the future may no longer exist. And also they let go of their attachment to possessions, to success, to achievements, all of these things that they've accumulated. And I think their spiritual awakening comes from this letting go. It's almost as if we accumulate so many attachments to the future, attachments to possessions, to appearance, mm-hmm. to beliefs, to knowledge, to our roles in society, that all of these attachments, they make us feel stronger. They give us a strong sense of identity. But ultimately, they create a lot of, they take away any space or emptiness. They fill us up so much that there is no space for our spiritual selves to shine through. But when we let go of these things, then there's more space inside us for a new self to emerge. So I would say that it's very important to practice conscious detachment, which means that you shouldn't depend on external things for your identity or well-being. You have to be aware that there is a deep, stable self within you, which exists in a natural state of wholeness and well-being. And if you can tune into that self, then you don't need any external things to maintain your well-being.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I love to give people homework assignments. It's kind of throwing on my coach's hat. If you were to give people one homework assignment today to help them on their path, on their journey, what would it be?
I would say choose one daily activity. So you could think of all the activities you do in a day, like you get up, you have a shower, you brush your teeth, you eat your breakfast, you walk to the subway station, whatever. Then you have lunch and so forth. But choose one activity. It could be having a shower, it could be brushing your teeth or eating breakfast. Mm-hmm. And practice that activity with complete attention. So give your whole attention to the sensation of the brush against your teeth or the water against your body. And if you feel your attention drifting away, which is bound to do, just gently bring it back. Like in the same way that if a child wanders away, you gently bring it back and bring it back to the path so you can walk in the right direction. Just gently bring your attention back. So for a whole week, practice that one activity with complete attention.
I love it. You mentioned children there, and just before the end, my wife Jessica, she always likes me to ask a question about children and parents. What advice would you give to parents today to help their children on their journey?
I would say, think of your children as your teachers.
Thank you.
We've said that children are spiritually awakened in some degree. So, yeah, they are our gurus. We can learn from them. They can teach us how to be present. They can teach us to see the world in the amazingly vivid way which they see it. So yeah, think of your child as your teacher.
Woohoo! Another question we like to ask just before the end, or we'll do a brief meditation at the end, is what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo factor?
I'd say nature. I get a lot from walking in the hills and through seeing lakes. So just being in a natural landscape gives me a sense of, oh, wow, everything's perfect. Everything's in harmony. And my being seems to connect to the nature, and my whole being seems to fall into a state of stillness.
I couldn't agree more. Where can people go to find your beautiful book and to find out more?
People can go to my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com.
Fantastic. And if you didn't catch that, come on over to inspirenationshow.com and we'll get you over to stephenmtaylor.com. Any last words of wisdom you want to share before a brief meditation?
Only that, one thing I think it's important to remember is that there's a good analogy for the human psyche or the human soul. And the analogy is that human beings are a bit like the ocean. There is often turbulence on the surface of the ocean. You've got the roaring of the waves, the swelling of the waves, the constant motion of the waves. But if you just go 1 meter below the surface, suddenly you're in the midst of complete stillness. And it can stretch for many miles down to the bottom of the ocean. So we're often caught up in the turbulence on the surface of our minds, but it's always helpful to remember that just below the surface, there's this deep ocean of stillness and harmony inside us.
I love that. You are not just the wave, you are the ocean.
That's right.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been such a beautiful interview. Such a beautiful interview. Do you have a brief meditation you wouldn't mind sharing with us?
Okay. I will lead you through a meditation which I call the Riverbank meditation. So it begins with a visualization. So I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment.
All right, unless you're driving down the road, in which case, do this later.
Yeah, that's right. So close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself sitting on a riverbank, at the top of a riverbank, on a warm summer's day. So you can feel the sun shining down on your face. You can smell the grass around you. You can hear the rustling of a breeze through the grass and through the bushes. You can hear children playing in the distance, birds singing as they fly by. And you feel a sense of ease. You feel very relaxed, very still, but also very alert as you feel the sun shining down on your skin. And beneath you, at the bottom of the riverbank, you can see the river flowing by. You can see the gentle motion of the currents flowing by, with the sunlight reflecting on them, creating patterns of light. And you can see the gentle foaming of the currents as they splash by. And every so often, you watch a boat passing by, maybe a rowing boat with 2 or 3 people in it. And as you watch this river flow by, you're sitting there at the top of the bank, very alert and very still, just watching the river flow by knowing that you are in a place of stillness, that there is a space between you and the river. And in the same way, I'd like you to observe your own thoughts. You can think of your thoughts as a river or a stream which is flowing by within your mind. And you are standing apart from your thoughts on the riverbank, watching them flow by, knowing that you are the witness of your thoughts. You are not thoughts themselves. And occasionally, thoughts will take you away and you'll find yourself flowing with them. But when that happens, just gently bring yourself back to the riverbank, to that place, that stable, still place where you can observe your thoughts. And you can feel the space between you and your thoughts. And as you observe your thoughts passing by, let's allow that space to become larger. Let's feel that space opening up. And into that space, you can feel a sense of wholeness and well-being emerging. You can feel a sense of well-being that fills not just your mental space, but your whole body, stretching down into your chest, down into your stomach, down into your arms and hands, down into your legs and your feet. You can feel a sense of well-being, a warm glow of relaxation filling your whole body. And returning now to your mental space, you're aware that when you look at your thoughts, when you look at the stream of your thoughts, they have become softer and smoother and slower. Your thoughts have begun to dissolve away. And for a few moments, let's just enjoy the spacious stillness within our being. And now, let's slowly bring this meditation to a close. And let's remember that whenever we become immersed in thoughts and our minds become agitated, we can always return to that place on the riverbank. We can always return to that stable place outside our thoughts, rooted deep within our being, where we can just observe our thoughts. So now, let's slowly begin to open our eyes, and let's bring this meditation to a close.
You're a great tugboat, my friend.
Thank you.
You'll help bring us out into the deep waters. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Steve. This has been truly fantastic. And I love your book. I early on I said, don't attempt this in one taking. This is something to be enjoyed and experienced. And there's so many great stories in there that I think they act as signposts to guide us on our way. And I think they give us hope that this is something that, in a sense, that not attain as in trying to win a race or something like that, but that there is something more dwelling inside each and every one of us.
Yeah, I agree. I think human beings are much deeper, and much stronger, and much larger than we tend to think. There's a great space, a great spiritual space in all of us.
Woohoo!
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great speaking to you.
Awesome.
So thanks a lot.
And thank you. For everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get the leap, and discover your own path toward awakening, and shine bright. Woohoo!
Woohoo!
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!